So I've talked about making your writing clear. I've said that if you do nothing else when you write, make your writing clear. But another thing you should seek to do is to make your writing easy to read. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. To begin this episode, I want to have a disclaimer first. So in my introduction, I said that you should try to make your writing easy to read. Easy does not mean simple or low level, right? It is not C-spot run, which is extremely easy to read. Unless you are writing children's books, I don't think that your writing should look like it belongs in a children's book. And maybe even if you are writing children's books, maybe your writing should not look like it belongs in a children's book. I don't want to diss children's book authors, but there is a difference between a really good children's book author who has thought about the words, who has thought about how the words go together. They're not using complex words, they're not using complex sentences, but they are still using elegant words. They're still using elegant sentences when they are doing their writing, and there's a qualitative difference between their books and children's book authors that are not trying to find the best words to write the books. And I think that even if a child is reading the book, I still think that they want good writing, right? Some of the best or most fun books that you might read are the Dr. Seuss books, and one of the reasons why his books are good is because he actually had to pick out the words that were being used because they had to fit into a rhythm and a rhyme. So they are really fun to read, and that is kind of what I mean by being easy to read. They are fun to read. They are pleasurable to read. And if something is pleasurable or fun to read, it is easy to read, in my opinion. And it's not simple at all, because if you look at Fox and Socks, it is a book that starts out simple and becomes more and more and more complex. And we can actually look at Fox and Socks as something we can learn from, to be honest, because Fox and Socks is a book for children, and it wants children to be able to read the book, but it knows that Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, knew that children were not able to deal with really complex sentences all at once. So what he did with his book is he started out with very simple sentences, right? The book starts with Fox, Socks, Knox, Box, Fox and Socks and Knox and Box, etc. And it ramps up the difficulty and the complexity of that book from page to page to page to page until you get something like, when beetles fight these battles in a bottle with their paddles, and the bottle's on a poodle, and the poodle's eating noodles, they call this a muddle puddle tweedle poodle beetle noodle bottle paddle battle, which is really complex. But if a child were to engage with that thing, it would not be easy, it would not be pleasurable or fun if they just started to read it. The words flow, of course, and if you're an adult, it becomes easier, though not much easier. But that is what I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about putting things in verse. I'm not talking about lack of complexity. I'm not talking about tongue twisters. I am talking about making your writing as easy to read as possible. And when I say easy, I mean pleasurable. I mean fun to read. And there are many different ways to make your writing fun. Or if you want to use the word pleasurable, that's fine as well. A good way of thinking about this is if a reader has a proficient level of reading ability, they won't need to struggle through your writing. And the reason why a person can struggle through writing can be varied. It could be the case that the writing is too complex. There's too much of a memory load the reader has to take on. So for example, and I recommend that you read Steven Pinker's book that's on writing. I can't remember what it's called, but read his book on writing because he gets into this a little bit. And I also talk about this in one of my podcasts about how, I don't remember, it probably has memory in the title, but readers can only hold so much information in their memory at once. right? And everybody can only hold so much information in their short-term memory at once, and that's what they're using to understand what's going on. So when you write, it could be the case that you are making your writing too difficult to understand because you are giving the reader too much to deal with all at once. Okay? It could also be the case that you have weird wording. It could also be the case that you're using a very strange word. There's a lot of different reasons why a reader who is proficient in reading would have to struggle through what you're writing. It could be the case that your prose is boring. That's always a possibility, and that's always something I think about, and sometimes I read my own stuff, and I'm like, man, I have to rewrite this whole thing because I think the prose is boring. And for me, if I think the prose is boring, I have to redo it. Other people might find it just fine. I've read other books where I think the prose is boring, but for me, when I engage with my own work, I need to have it where I have that pleasure when I'm reading the book. How do you achieve pleasurable or good or fun or easy writing, right? We're just trying to get to good writing that is pleasurable, that draws people in just because of the writing itself. I'm not talking about the storytelling. I'm not talking about the characters. I'm talking about the writing. Well, what we need to first understand is writing reflects speech. Writing follows language is one of my writing rules. And I've talked about this idea that the reader should not have to hold too much information in their short-term memory when they are reading. Now, you might think to yourself, well, if they're reading a book, they're going to have to hold a lot in their memory because they're reading an entire book. But that's not actually how it works. What happens when somebody reads a book is they read a part of the book, they gain a vague sense or maybe a vivid sense, depending on who they are, of what's happening in the book, and then they move on. And then they start to chunk information together. So the reader won't remember every little detail of the book, but they will remember key points that you direct them to, and this is important. So if there's something extremely important in the book the reader needs to know, you need to direct the reader's attention to that thing and make it salient. And then you probably have to probably have to talk about that thing again as you go through the book. You can actually see this play out in The Shining quite a bit. So in The Shining, the main character, I can't remember the main character. I think it's Jack. I can't remember. In The Shining, Stephen King does this, and he has this idea. So The Shining is like this metaphor, possibly, for alcoholism or drug addiction. And in the book, the main character struggles with alcoholism, and the place where they go helps him fall back into alcoholism. And during the end of the book, when it's nearing the climax, what you notice, and I've criticized this in the past because I think there are better ways to do it, but I mean, it does draw your attention to it. That is certainly the case. So you could say this is a good way of doing it. I think Stephen King, maybe since he wrote it in the 70s, I think, so maybe he'd disagree with how he did it now. I'd certainly disagree with how I've done things in the past as well, but it does stick in your mind, so it's a good example. But the character's desire for alcohol, I think his mouth starts to get dry or something like that, and he continually wipes his mouth. At the very least, he continually reaches up a hand to wipe his mouth. And this is to reflect this idea that he's slipping back into how he's done things. He's slipping back into his vice. That's how I understand that. So the reader is drawn to that idea, and it circles around and it comes back. And Stephen King uses the same phrase again and again and again, which I don't like it stylistically, but it's fine. It's all right. It's not the worst that I've seen. But at the same time, he uses that idea, and it brings the person back to that idea. It brings the person back to what is happening. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can have things parallel. So if you have a specific point to your story or your writing, you can have that thing pop up in different ways within your writing. If you are talking about death, you can show death in a lot of different ways in your writing. Or if you're talking about love, you can show love in your writing in a lot of different ways. There are different types of love. There are different words for different types of love. We know that. Or if you want to just show one type of love, there are still different ways you can show one type of love. And I think that this type of writing, this type of thinking when you're writing, can be really powerful. And it takes you from this very thin, one-dimensional writing to something that is bigger, something that is deeper. So with that love example, what we can do is there are different relationships and there are different types of people. And there are people who seem to fit together really well and their relationships seems perfect and everybody's jealous of that relationship. And there are people who have very combative relationships. And there are people you think, man, I don't even know how they're still together. And there are people who are odd couples. They just don't seem to fit together. And there's all these different types of people that are in love with one another. And you can present those different types of people and bring those people into your story. Right? And you can show those to the reader and make them salient. And then it comes back to the main characters and their experience in that area. And it's going to be more powerful because you've seen the other nuances. You've seen the other ways in which people can experience this thing called love. And that's just one specific idea. We do this in our writing as well. Right? So when we write, we have this circular idea. We have this writing in some sense is circular. I would say it's more like a spiral that is either going out or in. I'm not sure if I would say if it's going out or in. I have reasons for deviating and saying that. I'm not sure which way it would be going, probably in, because you're slowly getting to the point. You're slowly getting to the smallest thing you're trying to point at. But if you're writing, if you want to write well, if you want to make it pleasurable, you are trying to make it so that the reader knows what you're writing about. You are trying to make it so that the reader is focused on that specific thing. This is why I talk about writing as paragraph chunks, right? I do not say that in school, I learned that a sentence has a complete thought. And I disagree with that now. At least from a writer's perspective, I say that a paragraph has a complete thought. And within that paragraph, you are circling around a single type of thought or experience or whatever, and that is going to help you write better. That is going to help it be more pleasurable because the reader is going to be able to read that and be like, I understand that. They're going to be able to move on to another thought. We actually have chunks in our writing itself called paragraphs. We have bigger chunks called chapters. And you can break things down into paragraphs and chapters or even narrative breaks within those chapters, right? We can put 3 little dots and say, hey, this is where a narrative break is, and we can move on. So one really important thing is to remember that the reader has a specific amount of memory. Remember that the reader isn't going to remember everything in your book. Remember that the reader isn't going to remember everything about what you're writing about or how you're writing it, and you need to bring it back, right? So this is a little bit more related to storytelling, but I think it connects to writing as well. So writing is carrying ideas. The purpose of writing is to carry ideas. If you are a writer and you're not trying to convey an idea, you are actually forgetting the purpose of writing. If you're a writer and you're trying to convey gibberish, you can't, because you can't convey gibberish. By definition, writing conveys ideas. So if you want the reader to understand the writing, you need to make sure that the most important things are the most salient, and you do not have to be stupid about it. All right? Excuse my language. When you convey that idea to the reader, you do not have to be like, hey, here's the idea I want you to know. In some cases, that's very useful, especially in essays. But if you're trying to do it in a creative way, if you're trying to do creative writing that is a little bit more subtle, this idea of repetition actually works. But I would encourage you to be creative with this idea of repetition. Don't just repeat the same thing over and over again. How can you convey the same thing in different ways? Or if you are writing a single paragraph, and let's just say you're describing a person, when you are describing a person, you are conveying the same thing in different ways. Now, what is the best way to convey that single thing? It might be describe every single aspect of the person. It might be able to be describing one single aspect. It might be describing the actions of a person. And I have other podcast episodes that talk about this, so you can check those out as well. Now, then we jump into this idea of flow. So we're trying to make our writing easy to read, pleasurable to read. Flow is important. And flow deals with sentence construction, word choice. Maybe I'm being redundant when I say this, but how you put those words together, repetition, variability, etc. Any hard and fast rules with flow actually start to break down when we're dealing with this subject. So it's really hard to talk about flow because people do talk in a specific way. There are rules to language, But at the same time, there are many different ways to write. And I would encourage you to read books and see how those books put ideas together. And if you like how it flows, if you find the reading pleasurable, stop and see how that reading works. Now, that's one way to do it. But really, the way I think that you gain flow within your writing, the way that your writing flows, that you achieve a specific style of writing, is to actually do the writing, because you can analyze something to death, and then you can take the elements, and then you can try to use those elements, and you've created this weird monster from those elements because you actually haven't been doing it yourself. Now, eventually that monster is going to turn into something great if you practice it enough, but in the end, the ability to write doesn't come from reading. You can be informed. You can gain information, you can gain insight into writing by reading, but the ability to write comes from writing. Okay. So with flow, it's really difficult, but it comes down to these different things like sentence construction, word choice, how you put those words together, etc. And you need to practice. And that's all I've got to say about that. You need to practice. You need to see which words fit together best. You need to actually experiment. And I've talked about this again and again and again. If you are not willing to experiment with your writing and try different things, you're not going to learn what works best for you, and you're not going to find the style that is going to be best for you. Because it's not hard to write. I don't think it's hard to write. I just think it takes a while to get to the point where it is simple, right? It's difficult to say, right? I've been writing so long, so when I write, I just write. I don't think about it, I just write. I try to convey things as clearly as possible, and I've practiced it so much that I've gotten the style down. I know my style, I know how it works, etc. I know when I mess up in the moment I'm writing it, but I continue on and do it. But I think that you just have to practice, and you just have to work through it, and I think you just have to try things and find the fun in it. And I think that's one way to do it. One thing I'm going to leave you with, which I have talked about in the past before, is a way to test whether your writing is pleasurable. It's really simple. Just read it out loud. If it is fun to read out loud for you, it's probably fun to read out loud for someone else as well. So you've made your writing easier to read. You've made your writing pleasurable, and you've achieved one very important goal of what I think is good writing. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.